This is what we have to do to be happy. We won't be happy if we stay in the pot like frogs and wait for the water to get hotter and hotter. It might feel okay for a while, but ultimately we'll be better off revolting than boiling. We can't go back to brunch. We can't pretend that the rest of the world isn't burning, even though we can't see the flames from our front porch. And that brings me to the point of today's show. We can't see very much from our front porch. We don't really know very much about the world other than what we're told. And the fact of the matter is that what we're told is told to us by psychopathic billionaires. 6 companies own all the major media. So even if our well-meaning friends tell us we should just go back to brunch and that would make us happy, we know better. We need to keep fighting the system, but we can't fight the system unless we can see it, unless we have adequate, accurate information about that system. So my dear viewers and listeners, we have to keep fighting, but we also have to fight to be informed. Most of all, we have to know what to tell our well-meaning friends who are drunk on the punch of oligarchic media. They walk in lockstep with their favorite pundits. They all say the same things depending on which pundits they subscribe to. So it's our job not only to subscribe to good information, but to spread that information. It's also a big help when people send me messages about other information that I haven't discovered yet. According to the data on YouTube, we have about 900 people now. 900 people ought to be able to scour the world for what is really happening. And the other thing we can do for each other is to hold each other accountable. It's not easy to keep our footing on a slippery slope that's made greasier by the sheepdogs, even those who should know better. And who knows, maybe they do know better. I've been arguing for about a week now that there aren't any pundits, including Jimmy Dore, who advocated for Bernie or bust right from the beginning and stuck with it all the way through to the bitter end. There are a few good ones now that have come around, though. I just thought of Fiorella Isabel. I think she's probably been Bernie or bust all the way through and hasn't blinked. Although Richard Medhurst has never said anything that I can remember about Bernie or bust, I would consider him a stalwart on this team. It would be helpful if you know of any others who are advocating for Bernie or bust now and have all the way along. And we obviously need a better moniker going forward. I would say revolution or bust. And anyone who keeps trying to move the Democrats, including the squad, into a leftward direction should know better by now. It's time to start blowing shit up. Oh, I just thought of somebody else. Kathy Copeland Padden. Kathy Copeland Padden has been Bernie or bust all along. Speaking of Fiorella Isabel and Kathy Copeland Padden, here's a friend of theirs named Durga Adriane. And Durga also has a very expressive voice when it comes to saying what needs to be said about our current situation. Words cannot adequately describe my revulsion at watching the failed, utterly self-centered liberal class, unsurprising, and their cowardly faux-aggressive allies, who should know better, posting celebratory statements about a return to peace and prosperity and listening to Biden being like sitting by a warm fire in the biggest statement of delusion and or outright denial I have ever seen. Imagine claiming to stand for healthcare as a human right, doing whatever it takes to save ourselves from climate extinction, college and labor rights for all, and basic social democracy, then turning right around and selling out all of those ideals to 2 people whose entire political records prove the exact opposite, once again allowing Democratic Party corruption to prevail. Imagine thinking you're doing something good by electing a man who has been in the obvious early stages of Alzheimer's disease since the beginning of the 2019-2020 primary, and then pretending anyone who calls it out is a Russian bot. Imagine celebrating a known warmonger backed by warmongers, Republican neocons, and Wall Street criminals with a string of credible rape allegations, years of sexual harassment of young girls, who wrote the Patriot Act long before 9/11 in a thrust to enforce Orwellian domestic surveillance because you think he's better than Trump. Celebrating a man who humiliated Anita Hill to install one of the worst, most conservative SCOTUS judges because you think you're saving the Supreme Court from Trump. Being joyful at returning to the exact same policies that gave us Trump to begin with. In fact, denying that the Obama era caused Trump out of willful ignorance. I'd break in here and say it wasn't ignorance on Obama's part. Obama fucked the working class on purpose. making googly eyes at the man who funded Nazi paramilitary troops to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine and hijack their oil pipelines, who expanded our 2 illegal wars to 8 illegal wars, plus 6 illegal regime change operations, who gave the country away to Wall Street and let working people burn in 2008. Then claiming that after 5 decades of proof about Joe Biden and 5 decades of evidence about the Democrat Party's open war against all things leftist, you're going to dance around in celebration about voting this guy in, but don't worry everyone, you're also really gonna fight hard to pull him left. You will understand why I think you're all full of shit. Don't come demanding my help or support when the inevitable consequences of supporting this disaster come straight to your doorstep. And don't expect me to support your failed strategy of voting for more progressives on your shitty Democrat ticket. I don't give a fuck who is running with the Republicans or what beloved squad figure pretends they're gonna take over the Democratic Party. They won't get my vote. I won't be joining your little pussy hat tantrums and other performative charades pretending to demand progressive policies from the same people to whom you enthusiastically gave up all your electoral leverage. Let me break in again and say electoral leverage is what Bernie or Bust has been about all along. Not just a revolutionary bloody coup, but using electoral leverage to effect that coup. I worked my ass off for a political revolution that never was, believed in a movement of people that turned out to be cowards instead of revolutionaries, and a man that turned out to be no more than a sheepdog for the Democratic Party. And now I'm done. Liberals, you're on your own. And for you non-swearers out there, I want to encourage you to read this article. I'm not going to read all of it, but it's called "In My 50s, I'm Finally Learning to Say Fuck You. How Midlife Loosened My Tongue." To whet your appetite, I'll read you this brief excerpt. "The world has been particularly ugly these last few years, and I've walked through a midlife hell with nothing but a hand fan and a seltzer. My 50s, headlined by a perimenopausal chapter straight from the bowels of hell, have coincided with a ramped-up misogyny in the halls of power, the Me Too campaign, and a global lockdown. Night sweats, madness, and dizzy spells with a backdrop of Brett Kavanaugh, Harvey Weinstein, and the big orange mistake. Midlife panic with the side of protests and pandemic. It's been a wild ride with rage and sadness and confusion mingling with hormones to create a new me. Or, more accurately, to reveal a distilled version of me with all the old shit swept away. I truly have no fucks left to give. Or perhaps I have a whole new crop of fresh fucks to give, and I'm passing them out like Santa with candy on a fire truck." That's a pretty good writer right there. As always, I'll link to it in the information section below. And now to the main course, the Dunning Kruger effect. This is why voting is broken in America, by Marc Hoag. Marc is a California licensed attorney and founding partner at Hoag & Company, a global strategy consulting firm for the burgeoning autonomous vehicle and urban mobility sector. Marc's educational background is more scientific than social, but he's taking a stab at social writing here, and it's pretty good. The reason I'm reading it to you is because I want to address the problem I posed in the introduction. I want us to figure out how we know things, why we know things, and how that all sucks right now, and what we can do to fix it. And as always, education is the answer. Every time I vote, I try to wrap my head around how we, the people, are expected to make informed, educated voting decisions, not just regarding the presidency, but on state and local issues too. I try to educate myself as well as possible from the most legitimate, unbiased, academically verified sources as possible. It's a lot of work, but I think it's my duty as an American, an attorney, a business owner, a husband, and the son of an 83-year-old U.S. Marine father with a PhD who taught me that education is the most patriotic thing we can do for our country. I don't really care what political party somebody subscribes to as long as their choice was a properly informed one. What alarms me is when people cast their votes based on personal feelings or factually false information, often ironically to their detriment. I leverage this concern against both Republicans and Democrats alike. My disdain for uninformed voting does not take sides. I want to highlight something he said here that reveals that he's not talking about people who are selfish. I think he's assuming that people are trying to vote in ways that not only help themselves individually, but help the collective. He says, "What alarms me is when people cast their votes based on personal feelings or factually false information, often ironically to their detriment." So he's not talking about mean people, he's talking about people who would want to do better if they only knew how. That's the mindset of a good teacher. You go into it with the idea that the people you're trying to teach will do better if you can just show them how to do so. Back to the story. With ballot initiatives that require deep academic understanding of economic, historic, legal, and social issues, never mind the impossibly tall order to make informed decisions on complex science and tax issues, how are we expected to make wise choices on these profoundly deep and far-reaching topics? Most people's education on these issues is limited to little more than tweets, memes, and clickbait news headlines, which means that most people vote on gut instinct and feeling at best, and misinformed data at worst. And even those people who may be educated on the primary or root layer of a given issue are nevertheless utterly without knowledge on the deeper secondary or tertiary impacts. But this shouldn't come as a surprise. To deeply understand anything takes years and years of study, if not formally, then at least informally. And the difficulty with self-taught informal study, especially in the social sciences, is ensuring that you learn from the correct source material. And the fact of the matter is, in social sciences, there is no correct source material. You just triangulate the data the best you can. That was me if you couldn't tell. Unlike the physical sciences, the social sciences can be easily skewed or interpreted in myriad ways. I'm saying the physical sciences also can be skewed in myriad ways, but we won't get into that here. Just consider the impact of today's social media and the ease with which philosophies and ideologies can spread like California wildfires, not to mention Oregon wildfires, some for good and some for evil. Learning how to avoid cherry-picking material that bolsters our own presuppositions, feelings, opinions, and beliefs, never mind outright bad facts, is an extremely difficult thing to master, not just intellectually, but emotionally too. Indeed, one of the most important philosophical lessons I learned in the last decade or so was that it's possible to agree with a thing without necessarily liking a thing. That is, it's important to recognize an objective truth even if it contradicts your subjective feelings. For example, I'm a Tesla owner but would still very much love to get the new mid-engine Corvette, say, or a Porsche GT3 one day. So I may not like higher gas prices or an outright ban on new combustion engine cars, but I will absolutely vote for such things when the time comes simply because it's the right thing to do. So what if it makes my enjoyment of those spectacular fossil fuel-powered machines more expensive or indeed even unattainable? I'm skipping ahead a little bit here. I also still struggle with this separation of truths versus feelings or assumptions. In fact, some research I conducted for a later section in this essay on the U.S. education system completely contradicted numerous assumptions I held, and so I had to find an alternative explanation. But as with all things in life, the more you learn, the more you realize just how little you actually know. Before modern science, humans assumed they knew everything about how the world works. In fact, as Yuval Noah Harari explains in *Sapiens*, societies remained more or less stagnant because people were discouraged from questioning the status quo. Once modern science began to flourish, everybody started to question everything, and suddenly the assumption flipped from knowing all to knowing nothing. I recently learned that this phenomenon has a name, the Dunning Kruger effect. Simply put, the less somebody knows about a thing, the more confident they are in their knowledge. The more they learn, the more humble they become as they realize just how little they actually know, and it's only once they've mastered true competence in a subject that they remain legitimate, rightly earned confidence in that subject area while leaving their minds open to new evidence and new knowledge. Ironically then, with greater absolute knowledge and confidence comes a greater willingness to be proven wrong. Skipping ahead again, and it's ironic that I'm skipping ahead based on what he's about to say here. It's like thinking you now have a deep and multifaceted understanding of theoretical astrophysics, the history of ancient Greece, or even our own country for that matter, or the intricate layers of Hamlet, just because you read the chapter headlines or summaries of those respective subjects. I have to admit that some of the best articles on Medium still could use some good editing here and there, and mostly in this article it needs to be chopped quite a bit, so that's what I'm doing right now. I think the Dunning Kruger effect can best be explained with a pie. Suppose there's a pie of unknown size and flavor. If you refused even a single bite of the pie, then you would obviously know nothing about it. But if you took one bite of the pie, you would be forgiven for assuming that the entire pie is apple, fairly sweet, with a crumbly crust. In fact, you would likely insist on such a belief based on this first succulent bite. Now I'm getting hungry. But suppose the second bite were blueberry. Now you realize your assumptions were wrong. The pie apparently has more than one flavor, but how many more? The third bite reveals a strawberry flavor. At this point, all bets are off and you realize you have much to learn about the pie. And so you keep eating until the pie is finished. You've finally discovered all of its flavors and of course you promptly get sick. But at least you finally learned everything there was to know about the pie. I would break in here and say, you know how the pie tastes, but you don't know anything about the philosophy of the pie, or the person who made the pie. You don't have a theological understanding of the pie. Moving away from pies and returning finally to the rather more pressing matter of this year's election, even as an attorney, I realized I had no idea what to think about California's Propositions 17 and 20, for instance, because I've never practiced criminal law, so I consulted a good friend of mine, a criminal prosecutor, with hopes she could educate me more on these topics. And it turns out even she was undecided because, what a surprise, these are hugely, profoundly complex issues. Her final suggestion? That I study how other countries in the world tackle these issues to help make a more informed decision. And this is my point. I've noticed that most people tend to make their informed decisions based on confirmation bias-loaded media headlines, memes, tweets, and contextless yard sign quotes. I've seen vote no on Prop 16, equality for all signs, which, just to pick on this sole example, demonstrate a complete and utter lack of basic, yet decidedly complex constitutional law. Don't even get me started on our country's unique infatuation with political yard signs. My wife, friends, family, and work colleagues from or living in Europe cannot understand this. I know for a fact that I have definitely voted incorrectly on issues in the past, and as mentioned above, possibly as recently as several weeks ago for this year's elections, simply because I was inadequately educated on the issues. Never mind those few times in the past that I embarrassingly voted solely on gut feeling and instinct, something I deeply regret. And that's precisely why I was compelled to write this. This is scary stuff. Meanwhile, during the presidential debates, I felt like I got less educated, less informed every debate I watched. While the final debate was vastly better to the first, it's like saying that amputating a limb is better than getting a lobotomy. And let's not forget, the only reason for the marginal improvement in this final debate was the threat of muted mics. A debate between intelligent individuals should leave you walking away in awe, feeling like you've gained knowledge, depth, perspective. Think of how you felt walking out of, say, a fascinating lecture at university, for instance, or actually listening to two genuinely brilliant people discussing opposing views. Instead, these debates sound like some trashy newsstand tabloid, two ridiculous old guys just regurgitating pop news headlines, finger-pointing, question-dodging, and leveraging ad hominem accusations like two nasty kids on a playground, seemingly catering to the lowest common denominator, the least informed and poorly read strata of our society. I know that we Americans are raised to value our freedoms and right to vote, if only because they're baked into our Constitution, which I respect greatly. Con law was one of my favorite topics in law school. I was literally moved to tears the first time I visited the U.S. Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial during my final semester of law school. David McCullough's spectacular book, 1776, and the HBO miniseries based on its companion book, John Adams, gave me a tangible clarity of understanding our country's history and therefore its present in a way I'd never felt before. This is me talking. I would ask you at this point if you've ever considered the fact that the Constitution was written by white rich guys who wanted to keep things the way they were, for themselves. Maybe we could have a brilliant discussion about it. Back to the story. I've also learned not to take for granted or blindly at face value everything we're taught to believe, never mind that such unquestioning loyalty to flag or country would be tantamount to brainwashing and utterly antithetical with everything our founding fathers stood and fought for. I, on the other hand, feel that some of our founding fathers would have been happy to buy our media outlets and keep propagating their vision and views. So, as a threshold question then, if only as a thought exercise, what are all these unique freedoms that we're talking about here? What do we Americans have in the name of freedom that's so truly objectively unique to other rich Western countries? Europeans, for instance, have exactly the same rights and freedoms that we do, if not more so. In fact, just to pick on an admittedly silly and decidedly unimportant issue, apart from most Islamic countries in the world, only businesses on American soil need to post those pesky "no alcohol beyond this line" signs and erect a fence around outdoor dining areas to corral patrons in a protective cage like so many wild beasts, as if we're somehow incapable of being civil and mature with a glass of wine. Actually, Dubai felt even less restrictive in this regard than America when I visited several years ago. On a rather more serious issue than alcohol consumption, people don't die in most rich countries because they can't afford their medical bills, nor do they lose their homes. Sure, public health options are often inefficient or suboptimal, but at least they're better than dying because you have inadequate or no insurance at all. I don't think that public health care is necessarily better than private health care. Boo! I just think we should have both. You and Booty Gag. Now, we should debate that. Unfortunately, many of my fellow Americans hear such preposterous ideas as European/Canadian/everywhere else but here public health care and label them as socialist or communist, while hypocritically expecting the government to provide tax-funded services like fire and police protection, the military, and, inequitably funded though they are, public schools. But somehow, God forbid, if you need an ambulance or medical care, and if you expect taxpayer money to fund these things, then suddenly you're a communist. It's almost as if those same Americans didn't actually study what communism or real socialism actually is. Ding, ding, ding. A few years ago, I fell magnificently, wretchedly ill while on a trip with my wife in Edinburgh, Scotland, a bout of food poisoning severe to the point of being scary. First, our hotel advised us to call a national health hotline. I was never asked for my insurance information, and the entire call was provided for free. I was then advised to summon a taxi to be taken to the nearest national health clinic, unless I wanted an ambulance. I did not. Upon arriving, nobody asked me for proof of insurance. I was cautioned, however, that as I was an American, I may be required to pay for medication that could amount to $20 or so. I also had to wait about an hour before seeing a charming doctor, after which we were sent back to our hotel with a prescription that had indeed cost me about $20. If that's public health care, then sign me up. On the issue of voting specifically, most European countries have vastly higher voter turnout than we do, even though voting is not guaranteed in their country's constitutions. They also seem to value science more than we do. Germany's chancellor, for instance, Angela Merkel, has a PhD in quantum chemistry, so it's no wonder why Germany was the only country in the EU not reporting a second spike of COVID. Sadly, though, as of this writing, things have finally turned for the worse in Germany too, but this was the way of things a few weeks ago. Then it shows Germany having less COVID problems than the countries around it. Indeed, most European countries seem to value human life in general more than we do. Strange, considering our country's massive pro-life movement. The US still ranks 18th for infant mortality when compared to European countries and 30th in the world, largely because of our higher rate of preterm deaths. This means, to paraphrase the late great Carl Sagan, that 17 other countries in Europe, literally, actually value human life more than we do. They are willing to spend more money, or less money more wisely, than we are to save human babies. The only conclusion we can reach is that, as a country, we just don't care as much about our children as those 17 other countries do. This is an unavoidable fact, but also a very avoidable reality if we simply placed more emphasis on education. Well, we already know why we don't place more emphasis on education. As the late great George Carlin says, there's a reason that education sucks and why it always will. They don't want an informed citizenry sitting around their kitchen tables figuring out how badly fucked they're getting by a system that threw them overboard 30 fucking years ago. It's been 40 fucking years ago now. And to be clear, when I say education, it's clearly not sufficient merely to have a high percentage of graduates at all levels of academia. For instance, in the inevitable rabbit hole of research I fell into while writing this piece, which decidedly blew a hole in my entire Friday last week, update, and last Sunday, and yesterday, and today, I found that all my assumptions about America's education system were just plain wrong. Look at the chart below. What it shows is that when you add up the educational attainments at all levels, the United States is pretty high on the list. While my assumption that we had the highest percentage of PhDs in the world was correct, I thought for sure we were lagging severely behind in lower degrees. I was wrong. I am decidedly not a social scientist, so I'm not even sure how I would research this further at this point other than simply appealing to academics in this space. But clearly there must be some confounding factors to explain the unavoidable conclusion that we seem to have a vastly less well-informed voting public than people in other rich countries. Perhaps indeed academic credentials are neither necessary nor sufficient to result in a genuinely educated populace. Ding, ding, ding! I don't know. My concern is that this theory is not far-fetched. In America, the quality of public schools is directly correlated with property taxes. As a result, poor neighborhoods have less good schools. That is by design, people. So even if, say, 30% of a community has a high school or college degree, if it's a bad education, then those graduates will, on average, be objectively less educated and informed than their peers from better schools. And this is me talking, they'll also have less opportunity to advance themselves in life later on. The point of our education system is to sort people and then to keep them where they've been sorted. And the second point I'll make here, since I've already broken in, is that if the point of education is to keep people ignorant, then the better the education, the more ignorant we'll all be. Again, as George Carlin tells us, the point of education is to create obedient workers. People just smart enough to keep the machinery going, but not so smart that they'll question the authority of the system. Education is doing exactly what it's designed to do right now. The point of education is to stratify us and keep us in our places. Back to the story. As Americans, we should be ashamed that our education system has somehow failed us and produced a society riddled with holes of academic ineptitude that has resulted in this present state of political absurdity that has embraced our country. My U.S. Marine father is extremely disappointed and deeply concerned for his country. We all should be. But instead, we soak it up as the miserable comedy that it is, fantasizing about some sort of legitimate victory for one side or another, when in reality, we the people continue to lose.